June 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda stood in the shadow of a camouflage hangar, staring at an aircraft that should not exist. The fighter sat under canvas tarps, its bent wing silhouette unmistakable even in concealment. Blue-gray paint. White Star insignia hastily covered with Japanese markings. Oil is still dripping from the engine cowling. A Vought F4U Corsair. American. Intact. The plane had belly landed 3 days earlier on Bougainville after taking anti-aircraft fire. The pilot, disoriented and low on fuel, had set down in what he thought was friendly territory. He was wrong. Japanese infantry captured him before he could destroy the aircraft. Now the fighter sat in Rabaul, waiting for men like Genda to understand what it meant. Genda had spent 2 years designing tactics for the Mitsubishi A6M0. He knew every capability, every limitation, every number that defined Japanese naval aviation. The Zero was the finest carrier fighter in the world. Everyone said so. It had swept the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. American pilots died by the hundreds trying to match it in dogfights. But lately, the reports had changed. New American fighters were appearing. Faster, heavier, more aggressive. They refused to turn with Zeros. They dove from above, fired, and climbed away before Japanese pilots could react. Wildcats had done this occasionally. These new planes, these Corsairs, did it constantly, and they survived. Genda needed to know why. He needed the aircraft to tell him what his pilots could not. What had the Americans built? And more importantly, could the Zero still compete? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Corsair was not supposed to be studied at Rabaul. Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Truk wanted it shipped there immediately, but Genda had connections. He convinced the superiors that preliminary examination would provide urgent tactical intelligence. Time was everything. Every day the Americans pushed closer. Every week, more Japanese pilots die. Captain Jiro Horikoshi arrived the next morning. He was the Zero's chief designer, the man who had turned Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's specifications into the most maneuverable fighter of the war's opening years. Horikoshi was not a military officer. He wore civilian clothes, carried a leather satchel of drafting tools, and spoke with the careful precision of an engineer who measured his words as carefully as he measured wing loading. He walked around the Corsair 3 times without speaking. Genda waited. Finally, Horikoshi stopped at the nose, looking up at the massive engine cowling. "This should not fly," Horikoshi said. Genda looked at him. "But it does." "I know." Horikoshi touched the propeller blade, nearly 4 meters in diameter. He pulled out a measuring tape, 3.98 meters. Our Zero has 2.8 meters. This propeller is 40% larger. He moved the wings. The distinctive inverted gull configuration. Horikoshi traced the angle with his hand, pulled out a protractor, and measured. The wing root dihedral is negative. Look at this bend. They mounted the landing gear here at the lowest point. It shortens the strut length, reduces weight, allows this enormous propeller clearance without making the gear impossibly long. A younger engineer named Takahashi, who had accompanied Horikoshi, wrote quickly in a notebook. "Brilliant," he muttered. "Crude, but brilliant." "Not crude," Horikoshi corrected. "Pragmatic. They solved the propeller clearance problem not by making everything taller, but by bending the geometry to fit. We would have spent 6 months debating this in design meetings. They built it. They opened the engine cowling. The smell of oil and high-octane fuel filled the humid air. Genda had seen many aircraft engines. This one was different, larger, more complex. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, radial configuration, cooling fins everywhere. Horikoshi checked his notes, translated from captured documents they had received weeks earlier. Pratt & Whitney are -2,800 double wasp, 2,000 horsepower. Takahashi looked up from his notebook. 2,000? 2,000, Horikoshi repeated. He walked back to where they had parked the Zero for comparison. The Sakai engine in the Zero produces 1,130 horsepower. This American engine has nearly double the power. Genda did the math in his head. Double the power. He thought about the combat reports. Corsairs climbing vertically out of engagements. Diving away at speed Zeros could not match. The numbers were explaining what his pilots had seen. Wait, Genda asked. Horikoshi pulled out a field scale, began calculating. They spent an hour rigging the aircraft, measuring. The final number made Takahashi stop writing. For 1,100 kilograms empty, Horikoshi said, the Zero is 1,680 kilograms. More than double, Genda said quietly. 2.4 times heavier, Horikoshi corrected, but with 1.8 times the power. The power-to-weight ratio is actually worse than the Zero. Then how is it faster? Takahashi asked. Horikoshi pointed at the wings. Aerodynamics. Look at the chord, the thickness ratio, the taper. This wing is designed for speed, not maneuverability. Low drag at high velocity. The Zero's wing is designed for maximum lift at low speeds, for turning. Different philosophies. They examined the control surfaces. The ailerons were larger than the Zero's, but heavier. The control stick required more force to move. Horikoshi sat in the cockpit, pushed the stick left, then right. His face showed concentration. The control forces are very high, he said. At low speeds, this will be acceptable. But as airspeed increases, the forces will become enormous. A pilot would need great strength to maneuver at high speed. Our pilots report the Corsair does not turn well. Genda offered. Of course not. Horikoshi climbed out of the cockpit. These control surfaces are optimized for stability, not agility. At 400 kilometers per hour, the Zero is light, responsive, perfect for dogfighting. At 600 kilometers per hour, which is beyond the Zero's capability, this aircraft is stable, controllable. Different missions, different designs. They spent 3 days examining every system. The fuel tanks held nearly double the Zero's capacity. The armor plating behind the pilot's seat was 25 millimeters of steel. The Zero had no armor. The self-sealing fuel tanks had rubber layers that closed around bullet holes. The Zero's tanks were plain aluminum. This aircraft is designed to be hit and survive, Horikoshi said. The Zero is designed to never be hit. And when our pilots are hit? Genda asked. Horikoshi did not answer immediately. They both knew. 0 pilots died. The aircraft burned easily. The fuel tanks ignited from single bullets. Pilots who bailed out often did, so from flaming cockpits. The Zero was a weapon that sacrificed survivability for performance. The Americans had chosen differently. The armament inspection revealed more disparities. The Corsair carried 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. Genda examined the ammunition boxes. Each gun had access to 400 rounds. Total ammunition, 2,400 rounds. The Zero carried 2 7.7mm machine guns with 600 rounds each and 2 20mm cannons with 60 rounds each. Total weight of fire was actually slightly higher for the Zero if all ammunition was expended. But the Corsair's 6 guns could fire simultaneously for roughly 30 seconds of continuous fire. The Zero's cannons would be empty in 7 seconds. Volume of fire, Horikoshi noted. The Americans are not trying to destroy an aircraft with single precise burst. They are creating a wall of bullets. Any hit will damage. Enough hits will kill. Takahashi test-fired one of the Corsair's guns at a makeshift range using captured American ammunition. The sound was deeper than Japanese weapons, more of a hammering thud than a crack. He aimed at a wooden target 50 meters away. 5 rounds. The target disintegrated. The 50 caliber projectile has approximately 4 times the kinetic energy of our 7.7mm round, Horikoshi calculated. And this aircraft fires 6 of them simultaneously. Even without cannons, it is more lethal than the Zero against aircraft structures. They examined the gun sight. A simple reflector sight, similar to Japanese designs, but the mounting was sturdier, the optics clearer. Everything about the Corsair spoke to robustness rather than elegance. Welds instead of rivets in places. Heavier gauge metal. Structural members that were thicker than strictly necessary by Japanese standards. Their overbuilding Takahashi observed. They can afford to, Horikoshi replied. American industrial capacity is vast. They can add weight for strength because they have the power to move it. We must save every kilogram because our engines are weaker. Different problems breed different solutions. On the fourth day, they prepared for flight testing. A test pilot named Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced aviators with over 60 confirmed victories, would fly the Corsair. Sakai had fought against Wildcats, Airacobras, P-38 Lightnings. He had never flown an American fighter. The ground crew, working from translated manuals and intuition, spent hours preparing the aircraft. The electrical system was different from Japanese designs. The fuel mixture controls were labeled in English. The startup procedure required interpretation, but by afternoon they had the engine running. The R-2800 thundered. Genda stood 50 meters away and felt the sound in his chest. It was louder, deeper, more powerful than any Japanese engine he had heard. The propeller became a translucent disc. The aircraft seemed to strain against the wheel chocks. Sakai taxied slowly. The forward visibility was poor. The long nose blocked everything ahead. He had to swing the tail back and forth to see the taxiway. The Zero had excellent forward visibility from the ground. This aircraft was nearly blind. At the runway, Sakai opened the throttle. The acceleration was immediate and brutal. The Corsair used barely half the runway before rotating into the air. The Zero typically needed the entire length. Genda watched the fighter climb, the bent wings unmistakable against the clouds. Sakai's voice came over the radio, speaking Japanese with the measured calm of a man who had survived 2 years of combat. The climb rate is exceptional, passing 1,000 meters. Controls are heavy but positive. No flutter. Stability is very good. He climbed to 4,000 meters, then began test maneuvers. Rolls. The Corsair rolled quickly for its size, though not as quickly as the Zero. Looped smooth, with enormous energy retention. Split S. The dive acceleration was startling. Sakai's voice rose slightly. Speed is building very rapidly, passing 500 kilometers per hour. 550. 600. Controls are still responsive. 600 kilometers per hour. The Zero's maximum speed was 533, and the Corsair was still accelerating. Sakai pulled out of the dive, climbed vertically. The aircraft kept climbing even as the airspeed bled off, kept climbing on pure power, something the Zero could never do, at the top of the vertical climb. Sakai rolled inverted and pulled through into level flight. This aircraft has power I have never experienced. Sakai reported, I can climb at angles impossible for the Zero. I can dive to speeds where the Zero would structurally fail. But turning is difficult. The control forces are very high in hard maneuvering. Horikoshi stood beside Genda, listening. He is describing exactly what we predicted. Speed and power versus agility. The Americans chose speed. Sakai brought the Corsair down for landing. The approach speed was higher than the Zero's. The forward visibility was still poor. He touched down firmly, rolled out, taxied back. When he shut down the engine and climbed out, his flight suit was soaked with sweat. The cockpit in the tropical heat had been an oven. Well, Genda asked. Sakai removed his flight helmet. If I were in a Zero and saw that aircraft diving on me from above, I would be in serious trouble. I could not run. It is too fast. I cannot climb away. It is too much power. My only option would be to turn it into a dogfight. And if the American pilot is disciplined, he would not follow. He would climb away, come back with more speed, and attack again. Eventually, he would kill me. Sakai looked at the Corsair. This is not a dogfighting aircraft. It is an execution platform. Speed is life. Energy is life. Turning is death for this aircraft, but turning is all the Zero has. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The analysis continued for 2 weeks. Horikoshi compiled detailed measurements. Wing area, aspect ratio, load factors, structural strength. Every number told the same story. The Americans had built an aircraft for a different kind of war. The Zero's design philosophy came from the 1930s, from conflicts in China where maneuverability won engagements. Lightweight, maximum agility, long range for bomber escort. The Zero could outturn any opponent. In the first year of the war, this was enough. American pilots tried to dogfight and died, but the Americans adapted. They developed tactics that avoided the Zero's strengths. Boom and zoom. Dive, shoot, climb away. Never turn. Never slow down. Use speed and altitude as weapons. The Wildcat could barely do this. The Corsair was designed for it. Look at the wing loading. Horikoshi pointed to his calculations. The Corsair has 174 kilograms per square meter. The Zero has 107. Higher wing loading means higher stall speed, worse turning radius, but better high-speed stability and roll rate. They accepted all the penalties of high wing loading to gain speed performance. Takahashi reviewed combat loss reports. Our pilots report Corsairs attacking from above, always from above. High-speed passes. They fire, they climb, they escape. They do not commit to prolonged engagement. Because their doctrine matches their aircraft, Genda said. They understand what the Corsair can do and what it cannot do. They exploit the strengths and avoid the weaknesses. We, meanwhile, keep trying to force turning engagements where the Zero's advantages matter. But we cannot force an enemy who will not cooperate. The most disturbing finding came when Horikoshi analyzed the Corsair's structural strength. Using stress calculations in comparison to known American engineering standards, he estimated the aircraft could withstand maneuvers pulling 7 or 8 times the force of gravity. The Zero was rated for 7, but the critical difference was consistency. The Corsair could sustain those forces repeatedly. The Zero's light structure accumulated stress damage. Hard maneuvering degraded the airframe over time. They overbuilt it deliberately, Horikoshi explained. The extra weight, the heavy gauge materials, the redundant structure. It is not inefficient. It is insurance. Their pilots can maneuver at the edge of human tolerance, and the aircraft will not fail. Our pilots must be careful. The Zero is like a sword, sharp, light, but it can break if stressed beyond its limits. Genda absorbed this information with growing unease. He was a tactician. His job was to deploy available forces effectively, but effectiveness depended on the tools. If the tool was inferior, tactics could only compensate so much. Can we modify the Zero, he asked. Add power, add speed, maintain the maneuverability? Horikoshi shook his head. Not without a complete redesign. The Zero's airframe is built around a 1,000 horsepower engine. To install a 2,000 horsepower engine would require reinforcing the entire structure. Heavier mounts, stronger wing spars, reinforced fuselage. The weight would increase to where the current wing could not generate enough lift. We would need a larger wing, which adds more weight and drag. It becomes a spiral. In the end, we would have a different aircraft entirely. How long would that take? 3 years, perhaps 4. From initial design to operational deployment. We do not have 3 years. I know. They stood in silence. The Corsair sat in the hangar, its bent wings gleaming dully in the filtered tropical light. It was an artifact from an industrial reality Japan could not match. The Americans could afford 2,000 horsepower engines, could afford heavy armor, could afford redundant structure. They could afford to lose aircraft and build more. Japan could not. The Zero had been perfect for 1941. It was becoming obsolete in 1943, and there was no replacement ready. The reports went to Tokyo in late June of 1943. Horikoshi's technical analysis, Genda's tactical assessment, Sakai's pilot evaluation. 3 perspectives, 1 conclusion. The Corsair represented a fundamental shift in aerial combat philosophy that the Zero could not counter effectively. Admiral Yamamoto was dead by then, killed when American P-38s intercepted his transport over Bougainville in April. The new leadership read the reports with varying degrees of acceptance. Some dismissed the findings. 1 captured aircraft proved nothing. American propaganda, perhaps. Or an aberration. An experimental model, not in wide production. But Genda knew better. Intelligence reports confirmed Corsairs were entering service in significant numbers. Marine squadrons in the Solomons. Navy squadrons forming in Hawaii. Production was ramping up at Vaught's Connecticut factory. This was not an experiment. This was the future. Horikoshi returned to Nagoya to continue work on the Zero successor, the A-7M Rabaul. But that aircraft was still on the drawing board. Prototype construction would not begin until 1944. Production, if it ever started, would come too late. The war was happening now. At Rabaul, Genda implemented what changes he could. New tactics. Altitude doctrine. He instructed pilots to maintain height advantage, to refuse combat below 4,000 meters where Corsairs could use their power to climb back into advantage. He emphasized teamwork, coordinated attacks, using the Zero's agility to cover each other when American fighters committed to attack runs. It helped. Slightly. Loss rates stabilized. But they did not decrease. And every month more Corsairs appeared. More American pilots who had trained in the boom and zoom doctrine. More disciplined attackers who would not be drawn into turning fights. July 1943. Genda received orders to escort bombers to Guadalcanal. The mission would take Zeros to the edge of their range. They would have minimal time over target, minimal fuel for combat. The Americans knew this. They had calculated Japanese range limitations. They waited. The bombers never reached Guadalcanal. Corsairs intercepted them 100 kilometers out, diving from 8,000 meters. Genda saw them coming, called warnings. Too late. The Americans came too fast. They ripped through the bomber formation, 12.7 millimeter rounds tearing into unarmored fuel tanks and engine nacelles. 3 bombers exploded. For more began streaming smoke, turning back toward Rabaul on damaged engines. Genda turned his Zero toward the attacking Corsairs, trying to force them into a dogfight. They did not accept. They dove through the formation, used their speed to climb back to altitude, set up for another pass. Genda's wingman followed one Corsair into a climbing turn, trying to cut it off. The Corsair simply kept climbing on engine power, accelerating away. The Zero stalled, fell away spinning. The second American pass killed 2 more bombers. The survivors jettisoned their bombs and fled. The Zeros, low on fuel, could not pursue the Corsairs effectively. The Americans climbed away, disappeared into cloud cover, untouched. Of 12 bombers that departed Rabaul, 5 returned. Of those 5, 3 were so damaged they would never fly again. 0 losses. 1 aircraft destroyed when its pilot failed to recover from a stall while chasing Corsair. The Americans lost nothing. Genda landed with his fuel gauge reading nearly empty. He sat in the cockpit for several minutes after shutting down the engine, thinking about the engagement. The Americans had executed perfectly. They had used altitude, speed, and power to control the entire battle. The Zeros had been irrelevant. Agility meant nothing when the enemy would not turn. Range meant nothing when the enemy intercepted before you reached the target. That evening, he wrote in his personal diary, an entry that would be found decades later by historians, the Corsair is not just a better aircraft. It represents a better understanding of aerial warfare. We designed the Zero for individual combat, for the samurai duel in the sky. The Americans designed Corsair for industrial warfare, for mass production and standardized tactics that allow average pilots to defeat experts through systemic advantages. We built a sword. They built a machine. In a war of machines, the sword is obsolete. The captured Corsair remained at Rabaul for another month, then was shipped to Japan as originally intended. At the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal outside Tokyo, engineers conducted more exhaustive testing, wind tunnel studies, engine teardown and analysis, metallurgical examination of the armor plating. Every test confirmed what Horikoshi had found. The Corsair was overbuilt by Japanese standards, yes, but that overbuilding translated to survivability. American pilots walked away from crashes that would have killed Zero pilots. They survived hits that would have destroyed Zeros. The aircraft's weight, its supposed inefficiency, was actually a form of insurance that kept pilots alive. Japan could not replicate this approach. The industrial capacity did not exist. The Nakajima Sakai engine, powering the Zero, was already at the limits of its development. Creating a 2,000 horsepower engine would require new metallurgy, new manufacturing techniques, new testing facilities. All of that required time and resources Japan did not have. Instead, Japanese engineers tried incremental improvements. The A6M5 variant, introduced in autumn 1943, had slightly improved diving speed limits through strengthened wings. Maximum speed increased marginally to 545 kilometers per hour. Engine power remained the same. Weight increased slightly due to the reinforcements. It was not enough, not remotely enough. In the Solomons, Marine Corsair squadrons compiled kill ratios that seemed impossible. VMF 124, the first Marine squadron to take the Corsair into combat, claimed 68 aerial victories by the end of 1943, while losing 8 aircraft in air-to-air combat, an 11-to-1 ratio. Major Greg Boynton's VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, achieved similar numbers. 28 Corsairs lost to all causes, including ground fire and accidents. 126 confirmed kills. These were not exceptional pilots with exceptional aircraft. These were average Marines hastily trained, flying aircraft designed for their doctrine, altitude, speed, energy. The Corsair gave them the tools to execute the tactics. The Zero, despite its agility, could not force an engagement the Americans did not want. Japanese pilots adapted as best they could. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai survived by learning to avoid Corsairs when possible, to attack only from perfect positions, to disengage at the first sign of trouble. But veterans were dying or being rotated home. Replacement pilots had less training, less experience. They still tried to dogfight. They died quickly. By late 1943, the average Japanese naval pilot in frontline service had about 200 hours of flight time. In 1941, it had been 800. The training pipeline could not keep pace with losses. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs were expanding. New pilots arrived with 400, 500, 600 hours of flight time. They learned in safe environments, far from combat, with unlimited fuel and ammunition for practice. The Corsair's ease of production compounded Japan's problems. Vought Stratford, Connecticut factory could produce Corsairs faster than Japanese industry could produce Zeros. The aircraft stamped components, its modular design, its use of standard American industrial practices meant that production could be distributed. Eventually, Goodyear and Brewster would also build Corsairs under license. At peak production in 1944, American factories delivered over 400 Corsairs per month. Mitsubishi's best month for Zero production was 175 aircraft. Nakajima added more, but combined Japanese production never exceeded 350 Zeros per month. And Japanese factories faced constant resource shortages, bombing raids after 1944, and a shrinking pool of skilled workers as men were drafted into the military. Horikoshi understood mathematics. Even if the Zero were equal to Corsair in combat, which it was not, Japan would lose through attrition. The Americans could afford to trade aircraft one for one indefinitely. Japan could not. In December 1943, Horikoshi submitted a proposal for an emergency program. Convert Zero production to a new aircraft using the Mitsubishi Kinsei engine, 1,400 horsepower, with structural strengthening to accept the additional power. It would not match the Corsair, but it would narrow the gap. Estimated time to production, 18 months. The proposal was rejected. The Kinsei engine was needed for bombers. The tooling changeover would temporarily halt Zero production, creating a gap in fighter availability. The risk was deemed too great. Continue refining the Zero. Make incremental improvements. I hope the war situation changes. It did not change. It deteriorated. January 1944. The Americans landed at Saipan in the Marianas, within bomber range of the Japanese home islands. Corsairs provided air cover for the invasion fleet. Japanese counterattacks achieved nothing. The Corsairs, working with Hellcats, another new American fighter, decimated the attacking formations. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June obliterated Japanese naval aviation. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. American losses: 23 aircraft to all causes. The Zeros, attacking in obsolete tactics against aircraft they could not catch or outturn, were slaughtered. Genda, by then promoted and assigned to air defense of the homeland, read the reports with numb resignation. He knew these numbers would arrive. He had predicted them after examining the captured Corsair a year earlier. Prediction did not ease reality. By late 1944, the Corsair was the most produced American fighter aircraft. Over 12,000 had been built. It equipped Marine Corps squadrons, Navy squadrons, with supply to allied nations. New Zealand, Britain. The RAF flew Corsairs from carriers in the Pacific. Everywhere the aircraft appeared, Japanese resistance crumbled. The A-7M Rabaul, the Zero's intended successor, completed its first prototype flight in May 1944. Testing revealed problems: engine cooling issues, structural vibrations. The aircraft will require extensive modification. Production was delayed, then delayed again. The first operational A-7M would not reach combat units until after the war ended. It never saw action. Japan instead pushed the N-1K Shurden into production, a land-based fighter converted from a floatplane design. It was more competitive with the Corsair, capable of 450 kilometers per hour, with heavier armament, but arrived too late and in too few numbers. Less than 1,500 were built, against thousands of Corsairs and Hellcats. The impact was negligible. The Zero continued serving until the end of the war, increasingly outclassed, increasingly irrelevant. Late war variants like the A6M7 added minor improvements, but the fundamental design limitations remained: the Sakai engine, the light structure, the lack of protection. Zeros became kamikaze aircraft because there was no better use for them. In suicide attacks, maneuverability did not matter. After the war, American technical teams examined Japanese aircraft factories and design bureaus. They found evidence of numerous advanced projects that had been started, then canceled due to resource shortages or changed priorities. Jet engines in development, turbocharged high-altitude interceptors, heavy fighters with multiple engines, all abandoned, all too late. The captured Corsair that Genda and Horikoshi examined in June 1943 still existed, stored at Yokosuka throughout the war. American occupation forces found it in 1945, recognized the significance. It was eventually returned to the United States, restored, and placed in a museum. Horikoshi survived the war. He continued designing aircraft for Japan's post-war aviation industry, though he never spoke publicly about the Corsair examination. In private correspondence discovered after his death in 1982, he wrote to a friend about that June in Rabaul, "I knew immediately that we had lost a technical race. The Americans had resources we could never match, industrial processes we had not mastered, and a design philosophy that prioritized practical effectiveness over theoretical elegance. The Zero was beautiful. The Corsair was effective. In war, effectiveness is all that matters." Genda became a post-war Japanese Air Self-Defense Force general and a member of parliament. He rarely discusses wartime experiences, but in a 1976 interview, he reflected on aerial combat evolution. "We taught our pilots to fly like artists, to make the aircraft an extension of themselves, to value individual skill above all else. The Americans taught their pilots to fly like technicians, to follow procedures, to use their aircraft strength systematically. Both approaches work when the aircraft are comparable. When one side has a significant technical advantage, only the systematic approach scales. Individual brilliance cannot overcome systemic superiority repeated 1,000 times." Saburo Sakai, the pilot who flew the captured Corsair, survived the war despite being severely wounded multiple times. He flew over 200 combat missions, survived encounters with virtually every American fighter type. After the war, he wrote his memoirs and described the Corsair test flight as a turning point in his understanding of the conflict. "I had spent 2 years defeating American pilots through superior maneuvering. In 30 minutes flying the Corsair, I understood that maneuvering was becoming obsolete. The future belonged to speed, power, and altitude. The Zero could not compete in that future. We were dinosaurs fighting mammals." We were elegant, refined, perfected for an environment that was disappearing. They were crude, but adapted for the new reality. Evolution does not favor beauty. It favors fitness for the environment. The Corsair remained in production until 1952. Over 12,500 were built. It served in Korea, where it proved effective as a ground attack aircraft, its heavy construction allowing it to absorb battle damage and continue operating. Some countries flew Corsairs into the 1965. The last combat mission by a Corsair was flown by Honduras in 1969, 26 years after the type entered service. 26 years of relevance. The Zero's production ended in August 1945. Total production, about 10,430 aircraft. It served for exactly 4 years in frontline combat. By 1944, it was obsolete. By 1945, it was cannon fodder. The difference was not just technical. It was philosophical. The Zero represented Japanese military thought in the 1930s. Individual excellence, light forces, emphasis on spirit over material. The Corsair represented American industrial warfare. Standardization, mass production, systemic advantages that allowed ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results through better tools. When Genda stood in a hangar in Rabaul in June 1943, examining the bent-wing fighter with Horikoshi beside him, he saw more than an aircraft. He saw the future. A future where Japanese design philosophy, no matter how refined, could not overcome American industrial capacity. A future where elegance lost to effectiveness. A future where the war was already decided, though the fighting would continue for 2 more years. The Corsair did not win the Pacific War alone. No single weapon system does. But it symbolized a transformation that made American victory inevitable. The shift from valuing quality over quantity to achieving victory through overwhelming material superiority applied systematically. Japan had built the finest fighter of 1941. America built the fighter of 1944. In a long war of attrition, 1941's excellence became irrelevant. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.